Just this past week on Wednesday, Ash Wednesday, we began our rather shadowy journey called Lent. It's 40 days long, not counting Sundays, because Sundays are feast days. Sundays are always celebrations of the resurrection. But in the Lenten season, even when we say we are feasting, there is a certain shadowy, ominous undertone present to all we do, because we feast under the shadow of the cross. It's waiting. In Lent, we symbolically reenact the 40 days that Jesus spent in the wilderness, fasting night and day, steeling himself for the greatest challenge anyone could ever face. For centuries, his followers have imitated that experience, a 40 days of purposeful preparation, getting ourselves ready to follow Jesus to a cross. Some of us fast. Some of us do acts of kindness. Some of us give up something we dearly love. Others are more intentional about prayer or reading the Bible or giving alms. And all of those things are really good. And if you haven't chosen one for yourself, I encourage you to do so. But Jesus did far more than that in his 40 days of preparation. Jesus traveled to the wilderness in order to embark not so much on an outward journey, one foot in front of the other, but something I will refer to today as the journey in. The journey in. Inside our hearts and minds and secrets. Our secrets. This journey in does not come naturally to most of us, preachers included. I know pastors are supposed to have all these things worked out already. Emily and I promised to do so in our ordination vows. And we imagine that you imagine us in our studies, poring over the pages of Scripture, praying daily for the needs of the church, and walking down the sidewalks of New York, dispensing blessings to anyone who needs one. And we imagine that you imagine us who have made peace with ourselves somehow, having confronted our own demons in the wilderness of living and coming to a place of tranquility and self-awareness. We imagine that you imagine us to be well-heeled travelers of the inward life. But in the words of George and Ira Gershwin, it ain't necessarily so. It's not that I don't ever think about the inward life. I do. I even feel guilty that I don't take the journey more often. But the truth is that too much quiet and self-reflection frighten me. On some deep, primal level, it frightens me. I, like lots of other folks, spend a good deal of my waking hours trying very hard to avoid any real silence or stillness. If I am not cooking, then I am reading or cleaning something or talking on the phone or surfing the web or sorting through the junk drawer or reorganizing my closet. Anything to keep me from really being still, quiet. Spend a lot of time and energy at being busy, only to complain then to my spouse and others about how very busy I am. What is it in the silence and shadows that frighten me so? And was Jesus frightened when he looked at his shadows? Was that part of the fear of his temptation? There are lots of curious elements to the story of the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. Lots of very strange things happen in this story. First of all, there is the daunting challenge, the physical challenge of spending 40 days and 40 nights in what is one of the world's most hostile environments. I once saw this wilderness. It was 117 degrees the day that we were there. It was the hottest I had ever felt anything. The wind-blown sand blinded us. It wasn't fit for humans or beasts, and you didn't see any humans or any beasts. So I read this story and I wonder, how on earth did Jesus stay there for 40 days and 40 nights? Then there is that eyebrow-lifting character called Satan, something that makes us 21st century postmodern folks very nervous. Satan is not portrayed here or anywhere else in Scripture as a red creature with horns and a pitchfork. But in this story, Satan is portrayed as a real force in the world, organized evil, intelligent, bright, crafty, and something to be reckoned with. So, that's curious too. But perhaps the most curious element of all is the setup to this story. Just how Jesus got to be in such an awful place to begin with. The evangelist Matthew writes, "Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil." The Spirit of God, the Spirit of life and love and goodness and truth and peace and happiness and joy, that Spirit led Jesus to this awful place. And if that is true, then that would imply a rather strange partnership, a working together of darkness and light to produce something good, to produce something pure. Matthew seems to imply that darkness has a function in the spiritual life. Well, I don't really like that. Who wants to poke around in the shadows? Most of us run around the rooms of our lives, turning on the lights and turning up the music as fast as we can go in order to dispel darkness. We run from our shadows, and thus, sometimes quite inadvertently, we run from the very thing that could change our lives and set us free. Carl Jung wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." Matthew and Jung seem to agree that the shadows ought to be engaged because they have something to teach us. And this is how Jesus engaged his. He was hungry, tired and alone, when suddenly the devil appeared with three distinct temptations. First, there was the temptation to satiate his very real hunger. "If you are God's son, then take these rocks and turn them into bread. Satisfy your needs." Second, there was the temptation to test God by throwing himself off the pinnacle of the temple in Jerusalem. God's dearly loved Son, then throw yourself off of here and watch the angels come and rescue you. And finally, there was the temptation for power and prestige. Do you see all the glittering kingdoms of this world? Do you see that jewel of an island called Manhattan? Satan said. Just bow down and worship me, and you can have it all. In the narrative, these temptations are presented as happening very quickly and as being rebutted very quickly. Jesus doesn't seem to struggle with them at all. But remember that this encounter with the devil was at the very end of the 40 days. It was the climax of this 40-day interior journey. These temptations had no doubt been living with Jesus for weeks before this final battle, and that resonates with my own experience. Temptations often, or almost never, surprise me. Temptations have usually been around for quite a long time, in the shadows, before it reaches some kind of climax. And my tendency is to ignore those shadows, those temptations. But following Jesus in Lent is a call to look more closely in the darkness. So, Jesus stayed with his shadows for 40 long days and nights. Apparently that was long enough for them to do their good work. He was ready for what lay ahead. And then the most astounding thing happened. Matthew says that angels came and ministered to him. The Greek word for angel is diakoneo, from which we get our word deacon, which actually means one who waits on tables. Somebody who serves food, making Bob a deacon. Huh? What a lovely idea. At the end of all that darkness, at the end of all of that awfulness, angels with baskets of the bread of heaven. Very few of us would ever choose to go to the wilderness. But sometimes life, sometimes the Spirit drives you there. And I know from my own experience that sometimes you find yourself in a place so desolate that you wonder if you will survive. But here's the good news. For Lent and for always, even in desolation, especially in desolation, God is at